All right, so I have some basic steps in terms of drawing hair. Straighten this out a little bit. And the first one is, I'm just going to draw some like generic heads here. The first thing is when you're drawing hair, is that what most students do wrong when they're starting to draw hair is they think about individual hairs and they start to just draw what I call spaghetti hair, or it just looks like individual lines, and I get something like, looks like spider legs or something like that, right? That's one thing. The other thing that students forget is that we've already talked about hairline, and that hair just does not grow from the top of the skull, but there's actually going to be a hairline involved, and the hair is going to start growing from the hairline. Okay? So instead of me drawing individual hairs, when you think of hair, you want to think of it more like a solid shape, and that sounds kind of weird. But there are millions and millions of hairs on your head, so it would be impossible to draw all those lines and then even to have it look good. So if I'm looking at, where did I put my mirror? Oh, right here. So if I'm looking at my hair, for example, I'm going to start at the part, and the way I see it is like the part of my hair is like about here, and I'm going to look at this side as though it's a more solid piece. So instead of individual hairs, and I call this sometimes like the chunks. So if you get like, and this is with curly hair too, you get like individual chunks. And sometimes those taper out at the bottom and they separate and you get something like this. But it's a solid mass. This will be the neck of the person. It's more of a solid mass than it is individual hairs. And then I see the other side. And again, it's got chunks at the bottom like that. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. And then my hair has bangs, so I don't see the hairline. So that would be another solid chunk. So I'm looking at that more as a shape than as a line. So my first step with drawing hair is always to draw the chunks, is what I say. Oops, that's off the page. Draw the chunks. That's first. So if it is, let's do another little generic head. Let's say you have curly hair. And we'll do curly, shorter hair. So again, don't forget there's a hairline. With mine, with the bangs, they do kind of get covered up. But if they don't, and you can see the hairline, make the part go this way this time. One thing to consider is often that the hair doesn't just go straight down, but it kind of pops up first. So if I'm going to have curly, or let's say maybe wavy hair, and I'm just going to make this more short, I'm going to be looking at, and I'm not looking at a picture, so I'm kind of just making it up, but hair is not about getting it identical like the rest of the portrait, trying to get it to match. It's about getting the feeling of that hair. So you can see I'm drawing smaller chunks as it gets shorter. But it usually grows up from the hairline and not just go plastered straight down. So I usually start by going kind of up and then back around. So I'm looking for those individual chunks. So that's always step one. Draw the chunks, whatever the chunks are. If it's short and spiky and going straight up, if it's long and straight, how does it chunk at the end and like the sort of the breaks in between the hair? If it is long and curly, you might actually see like tendrils, like chunks of how the hair kind of chunks together. So that's step one, is try to draw that. Step two, and this sounds weird, is to draw the negative spaces. So my hair isn't that dark anymore, but you can see, like if I turn sideways, there's breaks where between the chunks, and that tends to be the darker. So even if you have like black hair, like you have dark hair, there is going to be spaces that have breaks in between the hair, and where that hair breaks, basically it's creating a shadow. The surface of the chunk is actually going to catch a highlight. Janelle, you can draw with me, but you don't have to. You're asking if you need to be drawing with me. You don't have to. You can just watch. So the negative spaces are going to be the spaces in between the chunks. So I'm not even thinking about these as hair. I'm kind of going the same direction the hair is going to go, but I'm going to look for those little spaces in between the hair. Now this is where, again, it starts looking like, I don't know why I'm using that pencil. It looks again like a bit spotty. This is kind of how it worked with the self-portrait too. Like we would find the highlights, we'd find the shadows, and then we'd worry about blending them in together. So it's going to kind of at first look like you have a pretty bad dye job, because you're just going to get these weird, like almost like spots or streaks. That's okay. So I'm kind of defining where those chunks would separate. I would do the same thing here, like negative space might be underneath this curl here. There might be a space between the chunks is usually where you find them. So it's adding those dark spots. Even if you have black hair, the spaces in between the hair are gonna be the blackest areas. The third step is to add texture. So instead of thinking of this as individual hairs, I'm going to be applying a texture to them. Now, the fourth step and the third step, I kind of do at the same time, because the fourth step might involve employing the eraser because it's adding the highlights. But if I can think about where the highlights are going to go as I'm adding the texture, then I won't have to use the eraser as much. So I'm just going to say add highlights and texture at the same time, because we did the shadows already. And I see a lot of people also just make the hair one solid value. Like if you have dark hair, it's just like all black, but it's not. If you even look like at my hair right now, there's like where the light hits it, you're going to get a little bit of shine on the top of the head. Anywhere you get a little bit of light, you're going to get that highlight. So you need to have those shadows, highlights, and midtones, just like everything else. Okay, so as I think about this, I think she's going to get a highlight like kind of like around the crown of her head there. So I'm going to add the texture. Not so much individual hairs, but as I add the textures, my negative spaces are going to start getting blended in. I'm also going to go, I'm still going to add texture to the crown of her head, but I maybe not go quite as intense. Leave it a little bit lighter. Now, let's say I get too dark. Like if I have lighter hair or I no longer see that highlight and I'm like, oh, you know, it looks kind of flat. I actually think I need to pull some of that out. Well, that's fine. Just take your eraser. And this ends up being like one of those finishing things I tell a lot of students. I'm like, need to make nice with that eraser. Make nice with the eraser. Treat it like a pencil. It's not always just a tool for when you make a mistake. It's a tool that you draw with. So usually when I use the eraser, it's a little bit too smooth. So then I still will go back over it just to add a little bit of that texture back in. But that'll start giving me what I need because I'll have shadows where there's negative spaces. I'll have highlights where there's light hitting, and then I'll have midtones. So I just got to make sure like the ends of these hairs, I don't want them to be too perfect. Like I don't want them to look too chunky. Like I don't want to see the contours, but I also don't want them to look like individual strands. So I kind of do play a little bit with just the ends of the hair to make them look a little bit more natural. Get some loose hairs here and there and blend it in. Now if I'm doing curly hair, it would be the same thing. I'm going to add the texture, but I'm conscientious that there's going to be some places where I'm going to get some highlight. And some shadow. So big things. Think of it as a solid mass that you're adding texture to, not as individual hairs. Make sure, just like everything else, that there is highlight, there is shadow, and there is midtone. That is the key to making something look three-dimensional. And that's really all of these steps right here, 2 through 4, are all about adding highlight, shadow, and midtone. It's kind of breaking it down into steps for you. So you can play with it and you can practice just by doing like a little head like this, because like I said, all of you are going to have different hairstyles and I'm only tackling 2 here. So you can kind of play with it, but keep those steps in mind as you're building your hair onto your portrait.